Welcome to Grammar 5H. In this booklet, you will be given 3 explanation pages. We are going to cover infinitive phrases, gerund phrases, and be sure to look on the other side of that explanation page because that's where we will show you how to sentence diagram both types of phrases. So now we're going to jump right into infinitive phrases to get the party started. So let's look at our explanation for infinitive phrases. I am going to just read the highlights over to you and we'll talk about one of the examples on the page. So let's remember, infinitives are verbals that act like other parts of speech. In this booklet, we're just going to focus on infinitives as nouns. So you don't have to worry about the adjectives and adverbs right now. So as verbs, infinitives can have their own direct object, predicate nominative, or even predicate adjective. When you have the infinitive and these functions of speech creating a phrase, it's going to be an infinitive phrase. And the fun part about these infinitive phrases is that they can act as their own parts of or functions of speech, all on their own, outside of what's found within them. So let's look at an example that we have in this explanation page. My favorite pastime is to read magazines. So here we have an infinitive phrase, to read, and it's followed by magazines. So this noun magazines is acting like the direct object for the infinitive to read. It is the object receiving the action of being read. So if you look at the next part of the explanation, you can see we've labeled magazines as a DO. But notice that to read magazines creates a phrase which tells us what the favorite pastime is. In other words, the entire phrase to read magazines is the predicate nominative in the sentence. So you can see that we notate that with brackets and labeling the entire phrase as the PN. And you know that it's going to be a PN because 1, we have a linking verb, and 2, you can switch it and it makes sense. To read magazines is my favorite pastime. This page also includes another example of an infinitive phrase, but I wanted to give you something a little different, seeing as you can do this by yourself. So let's go on to the next slide. We have, I need to make lunch. The subject of this sentence is I, and I am completing the action of need. So I double underline that. We do have an infinitive in this sentence, to make, and what is being made? The lunch. Lunch is the direct object of the infinitive, so I'm going to label that, but we know that since lunch is the direct object of the infinitive, the entire phrase creates its own part of speech, to make lunch. So I'm going to take away the direct object, and we know that since need is our verb in the sentence, to make lunch is going to be receiving an action. Need is an action verb, it's not a linking verb, so we can label the entire phrase as a DO. It is what is receiving the action. And so just to encapsulate everything, the phrase is a direct object, but within the phrase is a direct object itself. This is what we'll be doing for most of the book, is identifying the phrase and then identifying the function of phrase, and then also identifying the function of speech within the phrase. So it's all about analyzing these verbs and verbals. So just make sure you're paying attention to what is given to you. Now we're going to jump into gerund phrases. Once again, we'll look at the explanation page, and you'll notice that it's very similar to the infinitive phrase, it's just a different verbal. So gerunds act like nouns, just as infinitives do, and these verbals can also take on a direct object, predicate nominative, or even a predicate adjective. Together, the gerund and the function of speech create the gerund phrase, which, just like with the infinitive phrase, will act as its own function of speech within the sentence. So let's look at an example. Being a teacher has improved my confidence. We can recognize that being is our gerund and is being followed by the word teacher. Well, in this instance, being is a linking verb. To be will always be a linking verb. So we know teacher is not going to be a direct object. Instead, we know that teacher is a noun and that is following the linking verb, so that makes it a predicate nominative. So the phrase being a teacher is the verbal being and teacher as a predicate nominative, and that will be noted below. Now we can see the phrase being a teacher is the subject of the sentence. It is what is completing the action of improving confidence, which means that once again we'll bracket it. This time we underline the whole phrase because the entire phrase is acting like the subject of the sentence. So just be aware that you are going to have each of the verbals, gerund and infinitives, they will be either a subject, a do, or a pn. Within them will be a do, pn, or a pa. So you can either look at it on its own and the phrase first to identify what's going on inside of it, or you can recognize what it is, but either way you're going to have to do both in this booklet. Once again, there is another example on this page, but I am going to give you a separate one just so you have some more context for this skill. Her favorite hobby is knitting socks. Once again, we'll identify our subject, which is hobby, and our verb is. Now notice that knitting could be a verb phrase, but in this instance, we know that our subject, hobby, is not completing the action of knitting. Instead, knitting is a gerund. So watch out for that whenever you have gerunds following a to be verb. So we know that knitting is our gerund and socks is a noun in the predicate, right? So we could think, oh, well, is socks, hobby is socks. No, socks is not a predicate nominative. Instead, knitting socks is its own separate phrase, and the entire phrase is renaming what her favorite hobby is. So we can label knitting socks as our predicate nominative. We know that that would be correct because if we flip them and say knitting socks is her favorite hobby, it still makes sense. We have not changed the meaning of the sentence. And then of course we separate out that phrase from the sentence knitting socks, and we know that knitting is an action verb. Socks is receiving the action of the gerund, making it a direct object. Once again, go slow, analyze what the verbs are doing in that sentence, and you'll do just fine in this booklet. Now let's get into sentence diagramming, first with infinitive phrases. Our first sentence is everyone likes to be helpful. Let's identify our subject as everyone, and everyone is completing the action of liking, so we're going to double underline that. And then we have the phrase to be helpful. I'm going to bracket that. I'm going to show you how I will identify different parts of phrases to help me sentence diagram. I like to label the entire phrase by labeling underneath it, and then whatever's inside of the phrase I will put on top. I find that to be a little bit easier than trying to pile everything on top of the phrase, and it can get kind of confusing. But you need to find the way that makes sense to you. You could do it the opposite as me, but I recommend when you have to make your own sentence diagrams, when it comes to these phrases, to identify each part of the sentence. It's going to make everything a lot easier. You can even put parentheses around the infinitive phrases if you'd like to. But now we can go ahead and make our diagram. So we're going to start with our nice long line. We're going to intersect that to create a subject predicate. And then of course we do have a direct object with our phrase, so we make one short little line like that. And since we have an infinitive phrase, we need to set up our diagram to contain that. So we start with a pedestal, and then we have our infinitive little tableau. And you can see I've made the horizontal line quite long because that's where our predicate adjective goes, with a nice little slanted line separating the infinitive from the predicate adjective. Now we can fill it out. Our subject is everyone, and our verb is likes, and then we can put in our infinitive phrase, to be, and then helpful. And that is how you would diagram everyone likes to be helpful. And so that is pretty straightforward. You just want to make sure that you label everything first, and then it's going to be super easy to diagram. notice that the function of speech that goes with your infinitive will always be on the same line as the verb, and to is always on that slanted line. Now let's do a gerund phrase to finish up. Cooking shrimp is quick and easy. Once again, I want to identify the subject first, but this one it's a little tricky because it's going to be our gerund phrase, cooking shrimp. So first I'll bracket that, and then I can underline it. So now I know the function of speech for the phrase, but within the phrase itself, I have cooking, which is a action verb, and shrimp is receiving the action of that gerund. So I'm going to label it as a DO. Notice how I'm still putting it above, but slightly smaller than if I was going to label the entire phrase. And now we can do the rest of the sentence. So we have our verb, and then quick and easy are predicate adjectives. They are modifying our subject of cooking shrimp in the predicate, and they're being coordinated by the conjunction and. So, since we have a coordinated predicate adjective set, our diagram is going to look a little different from what we were just doing. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to have a slightly shorter horizontal line. I will intersect that to have a subject and predicate. And then, of course, since I have a compound predicate adjective, I am going to create that little triangular form that hopefully looks a little familiar to you. And I have a dotted line to put my conjunction on. Since it's a predicate adjective, I'm going to put a slanted line. Now we're not quite done yet. We still have our gerund phrase that we need to work on. So we start with our pedestal. And remember, for gerunds, we have a little step. And I've made that bottom step quite long because once again, we have to put in another function of speech, in this instance, a direct object. So now we can start filling it in. We have our root, cook, and then ing on its the lower step by itself. And since we have a direct object, after that short line, we put our word shrimp because that is the direct object of the gerund cooking. Now we can fill in the rest. We have is as our verb, and as our conjunction, and then quick, easy as our predicate adjectives. And that's going to be how you diagram the sentence cooking shrimp is quick and easy. Pretty straightforward again. It's just all about identifying your parts of the sentence. If you have any questions about this or anything else about grammar, please contact the person who grades your grammar at your Gideon Center.